couple days ago, I found this wooden lamp on Pinterest. For me, it was the most beautiful lamp I've ever seen on Pinterest, but I was a bit skeptical. There are a few things that don't make sense to me. I think the lamp is AI generated and therefore some mistakes crept in. For example, is that a shadow or a leg? And is this piece of wood going from the outside to the inside? Is it connected there? I don't know. And what about this piece here? Same for that. And also for this stripe here, it looks like the piece of wood is going from the outside to the inside. In general, if there are so few places where the sphere is held together, I'm not sure if this is stable enough for my purpose. That's why I decided to get some more AI input. Using Dolly 3, I created over 200 wooden sphere-shaped lamps. Unfortunately, none of them met my expectations, so I decided to postpone the designing part. The first question that arises is how to build a sphere, and I would say there is an easy option, using a lathe. But I don't have a lathe, and tools in that dimensions are really expensive. So I had to think about another way to get that job done. And there are two ways. First, carving a sphere using an angle grinder and a carving disc. The problem is I'm not that experienced with that tools, and even if I would, the sphere would never be round enough for my purpose. That's why I have chosen option 2, where I built an elaborate construction allowing my router moving in circles around a piece of wood. I wanted my sphere to be as large as a normal football, so my construction has to be large and accurate at the same time. To do that, I pressed some nuts in all movable parts to avoid wear and tear in those parts. The advantage in building this device in that way is that I'm able to adjust how freely the router is moving around the piece of wood. This reduces the risk for some unforeseen kickback and gives me more confidence using this device. Furthermore, to avoid some accidents, I decided not to carve the sphere out of one block. Instead of carving the sphere out of one block, I will split it in 4 parts. This gives me the ability to build my construction in a smaller way that it is more handleable. Also, I'm able to choose for each part a different species of wood. In this clip you can see if my router is fully tilted to one side, there is still a gap between the bottom and the carving blade, so I had to keep in mind that I have to top it up later. Once the construction was finished, I was ready to build the quarter spheres. To avoid wasting too much material, I decided to use small blocks of wood, cutting them at an angle and gluing them together at a circular shape. To guarantee that this thing will be round at the end, I had a football as a reference. But just taking a football as reference was not sufficient enough for me, so I decided to calculate again. Therefore, writing on wood is a great thing. If you do some faults, you can send them away. Once that's done, it's time for gluing them together. Maybe you've noticed that my construction, which is holding my router, is just moving in one direction. My idea behind that was not just moving the router around the piece of wood, but also move the piece of wood under the router. To do that, I will glue my pieces of wood on a plate of wood which will be saccharified. Then I drill a hole in the middle of this plate and I drill a hole in the middle of my device under the router. Connecting both with another screw gives me the possibility to rotate this piece of wood under my router. You will see routing those half spheres or quarter spheres will produce many dust. In this clip you can see me trying to reduce this amount of dust in cutting those things as round as possible. By the way, over the whole project I was trying to make sure only using wood with the right moisture. In the past there are many projects where I have used cheap wood with too much moisture in there. Unfortunately, I can say by my own experience that this will cause some movement. And because the sphere has to be hollow at the end and the edge as thin as possible, I don't want to become an egg-shaped piece of scrap. While I'm carving those parts, let us discuss again the design of this sphere. Most of the images Dolly 3 gave me were just wooden spheres with round holes in it. But like the original one, I wanted to have some sort of basement too. My plan is to keep the organic look. Unfortunately, building some organic shaped stuff out of wood is not that easy. So there are two options again. The first option is bending some wood. And the second option is carving wood. Both options I've never done before. And unfortunately, both options are also known as one of the hardest parts in woodworking at all. At least I'm thinking in that way. And as you can see, I'm not even capable of taking off the wood which has to be sacrificed. So for me it was clear to take option 2, carving some legs. The problem now is how to connect the legs to my sphere. In the original one there is some sort of transition between the sphere itself and the leg. And in the original one there is one leg becoming to be a shadow, so I'm not sure how this will turn out at the end. And that's why I was thinking about to design my own legs. But let us postpone this problem and solve it later. While taking off this part of my sphere, I made sure to just sacrifice the wood which has to be sacrificed and not my thumb too. During all of my projects I tried to clean the workshop in between because this workshop isn't mine. This workshop is part of the basement of my grandparents' home, which they don't use anymore. But there is still some stuff in this room which is needed from time to time. And especially my grandma is not that happy how dirty it is there sometimes. And because I forgot to carve the top and the bottom of the sphere, all of the cleaning was for absolutely nothing, because it took me at most 5 minutes to produce at least the same amount of dust. This piece I'm carving here is planned to be the top of the sphere. And this piece is also the first one where I'm a bit nervous. I was not really much happy how the gluing looks like, and for my taste there was also too much tear out. But because I'm really good in postpone things, I decided to start the base and see later if I have to redo this piece. For me, building the top and the bottom of the sphere was the most hardest part, because it was really hard to estimate how much material I need and how much material I can left. Of course I want to use at least material as possible, since walnut isn't known to be really cheap. While carving the lower part of the sphere, I left 3 vertices rough, so I have some flat edges where I can glue on the legs. Of course, on those flat surfaces there is still a bit glue left, which has to be removed before gluing on the legs. For me it was important to have some really flat surfaces, otherwise one can see a gap where the leg is glued on. To give me some freedom carving the legs later, I let the legs as big as possible. At this point, unfortunately, I imagined that it would look cool if the leg is a bit round towards the outside. We will see later that this probably was the worst decision over the whole build. Fortunately, I'm really happy with how both of the other legs turned out. Because I don't want to have some hard edges where light wood meets dark wood, I wanted to have some sort of organic shape transition between those two. Therefore I glued some additional blocks onto the lower part of the sphere, which I want to carve out later. Because the sphere will have a lot of holes, it will also be seen from the inside. And I definitely don't want to see some hard edges on the inside. That's why I decided to carve out the inside as round as possible. Therefore I use an angle grinder and the finest of Kutzall's carving discs. Probably a coarser one would be better for this job, but I have seen a lot of videos with really bad accidents using those carving discs. That's why I decided to carve longer, but staying a bit more safe. I was struggling a lot with how thin the walls should be. On one hand, a thinner wall looks definitely better, but on the other hand, a thin wall will break earlier. Maybe this is a good point to mention that I never carved anything before. Using a steel brush and a drill, I was trying to get some cleaner surface on the inside of my sphere. Carving the legs was one of the most difficult tasks over the whole project. When I was at school, I was always one of the art lovers and not one of the musicians. That's why I built an electric guitar in my last video and didn't play it myself. Creating things is just more fun. Unfortunately, I've always been one of those people who were bad at art. No matter how hard I try, my drawings always look like rough sketches and my paintings have no real depth or color harmony. I just don't have a good sense of proportion and perspective. Although I really admire the creative side of art, it seems to me that my skills are just not good enough to realize what I have in mind. The next day I woke up with the firm intention of finally milling the legs of my sculpture properly. But the longer I thought about it, the more I dreaded the task. I couldn't get the fake leg from the previous day out of my mind and I felt unsure whether I could do it better. In the end, I decided again to postpone something, this time milling the legs. Instead, I turned my attention to the inside of this sculpture. The finishing work there was also challenging, but I felt more confident about it. The internal structure was complicated and required precision, but they seemed less daunting than the legs. So I spent the day milling the insides, hoping that tomorrow I would find the courage to face the legs again. For this work I reached for a Dremel, a tool I also had never used before. Using different attachments I tried to work out the fine details of the inner structure. It was a challenge as I first had to learn how to use a Dremel. Each attachment had its own function and required a specific technique. I tried out different attachments to achieve the best possible result. I was very careful and kept checking whether the milled areas matched to the rest of the sculpture's structure. Again, I used Kutzall attachments, which are known for being extremely sharp and dangerous. I had to guide my fingers very close to the attachments, which make the work particularly risky. To avoid injuries, I was forced to work extremely carefully and precisely, at least until I reached into the cutter for the first time. Fortunately, it only felt like sandpaper. In the colder month of the year, especially in winter, I'm often drawn outside for a run. Regular exercise in the fresh air is not only good for my body, but also for my mind. However, running in winter also has its downsides. The cold and friction often cause thick calluses to form on the feet. These calluses are not only unattractive to look at, but can also be painful if they tear. It is therefore necessary to remove the calluses regularly. You often hear about various tools and products from cosmetic shops that are supposed to work wonders for removing calluses. But to be honest, I always found these methods too time-consuming and cumbersome. I started looking for a more efficient solution and eventually came across an orbital sander with 100 grit. Although this was a significant improvement, there were still some disadvantages. Firstly, the orbital sander was quite large and heavy, which made the precision work on the feet difficult. Secondly, the device produced a strange odor when sanding, which was unpleasant. One day I had a new idea. The Dremel could be a suitable alternative. The Dremel, a multifunctional tool that can be used in many different trades, seemed ideal for removing calluses. It is compact, handy and enables precise work. The Dremel also offers a variety of attachments that can be changed as required easily. I imagined that the flexibility and precision of the Dremel could make calluses removal much easier and faster. While I was working on the sculpture, I was overcome by doubts about the design of the legs. The aesthetic balance of the whole piece was particularly important to me, and I was worried that the legs would appear bulky and heavy in proportion. The sculpture will have many holes through which the light can shine. At the same time, this makes for a much lower visual weight. I didn't want the proportion between the sphere and the legs to be unbalanced enough. After a careful consideration and analysis, I finally decided to mill the legs of the sculpture thinner. This decision was not easy, as it meant that I had to take back a large part of the work I already done and start from scratch. But the idea that the final sculpture could be unbalanced by oversized legs was unacceptable to me. I began to redesign the legs with great care and precision. Milling required not only manual dexterity, but also a keen sense of proportion and aesthetics. I worked slowly and methodically, always making sure the legs would be more delicate, but still remain stable and long-bearing. It was a balancing act between artistic vision and technical feasibility. When reworking the legs, it turned out that the third leg was not that aesthetically pleasing as the others. It was less elegant and appeared somewhat clumsy, but was located at the back of the sculpture where it was less noticeable. In contrast, the other two legs were much more beautiful than before. Their slimmer and more harmonious design contributed significantly to the elegant overall appearance of the sculpture. After several hours of intensive drawing, I finally found a design that I liked. To carve out the large holes, I started with a rough pilot hole using different drill bits. I planned to join these pilot holes later with the Dremel to achieve the final shape. During this process, however, I broke several drill bits, which make the work more difficult and slower. Once I had created the pre-drilled holes, I started to join them with the Dremel. However, I soon realized that the Dremel had difficulty penetrating the thick wall of the sculpture efficiently. The wall thickness was up to 2 centimeters, which was a considerable challenge for the small tool. As I worked my way through the material, I realized that a stronger Dremel or a more powerful tool would have made this process much easier. The current Dremel I was using, while handy and versatile, was not ideal for this specific task. The work was slower than expected and required significantly more effort and strength than I had originally anticipated. Several times I had to take breaks to let the Dremel cool down and make sure I wasn't overworking the tool. Each of these interruptions prolonged the whole working process and made me think about alternative methods. Nevertheless, I stuck to my plan as the precise handling of the Dremel was crucial for the fine finishing of the holes. Despite the difficulties, I continued my work. It was a tough process and I had to be extra careful to maintain the desired shape and aesthetics. During this intensive work, I appreciated the versatility of the Dremel, even though I wished I had a more powerful model that was better suited for these robust tasks. In the end, however, I was happy with the result. The connected holes blended well with the overall design of the sculpture and contributed to the desired visual lightness. This experience proved to me that sometimes the worst tool does the job, but that it is worth investing in more powerful equipment to make the work more efficient and enjoyable. Once the holes were finished, I wanted to give the sculpture more three-dimensionality. To achieve this goal, I decided to deepen the connections in the holes inwards. These recesses were intended to increase the impression of depth and complexity, which would make the sculpture appear more lively and dynamic. For this task, I reached for the Dremel again. I began carefully to carve the inside walls of the holes, placing the joints on the inside. This process required a steady hand and a lot of patience, as the even deepening of the holes was crucial for the desired three-dimensional appearance. If the surface was uneven, the spherical shape would be lost. Throughout the work, I took special care not to distort the original shape of the holes. It was important for me to maintain the aesthetics and the design while working on the depth of the joints. In order not to create too many dimensions and to keep the sculpture visually balanced, I made the depth of the strokes similar deep. One problem that arose was the shape of the Dremel. As the tip of the Dremel was not sharp enough, it proved impossible to mill perfect edges. Despite my best efforts, there were always small curves that I couldn't remove completely. This affected the precision of my work and made it more difficult to achieve the desired sharpness and definition. Despite this challenge, I did my best to make the edges as clean and precise as possible. I worked slowly and with concentration to get the best out of the tool and keep the shapes as close to my vision as possible. By the way, I use a Sharpie while working to make the lines more visible. It seemed to me to be the practical solution to define the contours more clearly and improve the precision of my work. In general, Sharpie is not necessarily the best tool for such tasks. On the one hand, a Sharpie proved difficult to sand down as it penetrates deeper into the wood than a pencil, for example. This meant that the lines were still visible after sanding and the surface looked uneven. I also had concerns about possible color changes to the wood. It turned out that adding could change the color of the wood, especially on light colored wood. After oiling, purple discoloration could occur, which would affect the aesthetics appearance of the sculpture. To avoid this, I tested the adding on a piece of scrap wood in advance. To my relief, I was unable to detect any discoloration on the maple and walnut wood. Nevertheless, you should be aware that these problems could occur with other types of wood, especially lighter colored woods. In order to remove the rough grooves of the milling cutter and the curves already mentioned, I decided to use a chisel to rework all the corners and edges. This seemed to me to be an effective method of achieving the desired sharpness and precision, but even this task proved to be complicated. My smallest chisel had a width of 4 mm, which, despite its small size, was still quite large compared to the sharp edges that abounded in the sculpture. This made fine work difficult and made it hard to achieve the desired results. I had to be extremely careful not to accidentally remove too much material or leave unwanted marks. Working with the chisel required again a steady hand and good judgment. I worked slowly and precisely, carefully planning and executing each cut. It was a challenge to work the various edges and corners of the sculpture while maintaining the desired symmetry and balance. During my work, I realized that the Dremel occasionally removed too much material, especially in the finer areas of the sculpture. To counteract this problem, I increasingly resorted to use the chisel to rework the struts. This manual method enabled me to achieve the desired results, albeit in a much larger amount of time. However, I also encountered obstacles here, as the chisel was sometimes too large for certain areas. The fine details and sharp edges required a smaller tool head to work them properly. In such cases, I had to find alternative solutions and get creative to achieve the desired results. Despite the challenges, I was determined to perfect the sculpture down to the smallest detail, at least as well as my skills would allow. I continued to work with patience and perseverance, switching between Dremel and chisel as needed. This flexible approach allowed me to fulfill the different requirements of the sculpture and achieve the best possible result. For the final step of the sculpture, the sanding, I start with the outside of the sphere. However, this turned out to be a nightmare. I started with the outside surface, my main aim being to avoid creating any flat spots that could detect from the overall look. To achieve an even sanding effect and minimize the risk of flat spots, I resorted to using all of the soft pads I have available and placed them between the sandpaper and the sanding machine. These soft pads provided a soft sanding surface that allowed me to glide smoothly over the curves and bumps of the ball without affecting the wood too much. After spending a while sanding, I realized that some areas of the sculpture didn't look light enough and had too much visual mass. Despite my efforts to achieve an even surface, it seemed that certain areas were still too dominant. I realized that I need to make further adjustments to achieve the desired lightness and aesthetics that I wanted. It was a challenge to figure out the best way to correct these areas without compromising the overall artwork. After another hour of drawing, erasing, and drawing again, the whole process started all over again. Fortunately, I managed to adjust the affected areas and restore the visual balance of the sculpture. Each step brought me closer to the final appearance I had envisioned and gave me the feeling that my efforts were paying off. From the outset, my plan was to design the sculpture in such a way that the sphere did not have to be glued together. The practical reason for this was, if the light bulb broke, it could simply be replaced without affecting the structure of the sculpture. However, this decision presented me with a design challenge, as it is more difficult to make two loose parts equally wide, deep, and curved than to work on one part. I didn't really want to use the Dremel this late in the process because it has a lot of power and can therefore easily make deep scratches in the surface. In addition, there are now many fragile areas that break more easy due to the greater force extended by the Dremel and can no longer be glued together since the surface is too small. But the crappiest task was still to come, grinding the struts. The ball consists only of fine and small holes, all of which have to be sanded from the inside too. No machine can get into these gaps. That means I had to sand everything by hand for different grits. This step alone cost me as much time as everything else put together, but in the end I was quite happy with the result. Of course, there are a few places that could have been better, but I simply wasn't in a position to sand any longer because I would have made it worse. I would say that the areas are generally not particularly good, but for the conditions of sanding everything by hand in small corners, at least for me, it couldn't have been done any better. Of course, one can invest even more time to achieve an even better result, but I quickly realized that this is a Sisyphus task. I would grind for months until I was satisfied with the result. At first I was wondering which light source to use. For a long time I wanted to use an LED strip, but I think a light bulb is more suitable. Changing a light bulb is more quicker and easier than changing a glued-in LED stripe. Besides, there are many beautiful light bulbs available nowadays. I use an oil that reflects very little. I wasn't sure whether the light source could be glare too much when the wood reflects light in some places. Similar to sanding, I was surprised at how time-consuming oiling is with such a complex shape. I normally allow 15 to 20 minutes for oiling. Here it took me over 2 hours to reach every spot. Normally, this can lead to major problems. If you apply too much oil, the oil can start to dry and become sticky. The only way to get rid of this effect is to sand off all the oil. I wanted to avoid this at all costs, which is why I was very stressed during the oiling process. Fortunately, this oil had a longer working time and everything went well. The last step was then quite simple. I modified the E27 socket a little because it was otherwise too bulky for me and glued it in. A small test confirmed that everything works well. And if you liked the video, I would be very happy about a like or a subscription. If you like the lamp, you are very welcome to visit my Etsy store where you can buy it. You will find the link in the description. Please note, however, that I only have this one piece. Once it is sold, it is no longer available. But you can also find other handmade products in my store that might also suit for your taste. I would love to hear from you. Let me know what you think about the lamp in the comments. Of course, you are also more than welcome to watch my other videos. In my last one, I built a working guitar for my dad.